The grand house on the edge of the city stood tall like a monument of wealth. Its high windows gleamed in the sunlight, and its wide gardens stretched out as though they were made for display. To outsiders, it looked perfect, almost like a dream. But inside the walls of that house, silence often felt heavier than gold, and sadness lingered like a shadow that never left. Margaret, the lady of the house, was known in the neighborhood for her elegance. She came from a wealthy family, and her husband, Richard, was a successful businessman. People admired her polished smile, her designer dresses, and the grand events she hosted. But what they didn't see was the constant worry hidden in her eyes. Behind the chandeliers and decorated halls, there was a problem that no expert, no doctor, no counselor had managed to solve. Her only child, Samuel, was the reason for her endless search for help. He was 10 years old, quiet and withdrawn. From the day he was born, Margaret had hoped her son would bring joy into her life, a reason to celebrate more than wealth could ever provide. But Samuel never laughed like other children. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were soft and clipped, as though he were afraid the world would not hear him correctly. Margaret and Richard had taken him to doctors in the city, specialists in Europe and therapists across the country. Each one had given a different answer. Some said he was shy, others suggested complicated treatments, and still others whispered that perhaps he would never change. Margaret had spent thousands, sometimes even millions, searching for the cure to what she believed was her son's broken spirit, yet nothing worked. It was in the middle of this storm of hopelessness that Angela arrived. Angela was not what Margaret would have chosen for herself. She was a maid, hired in desperation after the last staff member quit. She came from a poor part of town, where houses were small and lives were hard. She had worked in many homes before, always cleaning, cooking, or caring for children. She was quiet when she first arrived, respectful and careful not to make mistakes. Her dark skin and plain clothes made her stand out against the polished marble floors of Margaret's world. At first, Margaret thought little of her. To her, Angela was just another worker, someone to dust the shelves, polish the silver, and make sure the house looked perfect for guests. But what Margaret didn't know was that Angela had something no doctor or expert had ever offered: a patient heart. The first time Angela noticed Samuel was on her second day in the house. She was cleaning the library, a grand room filled with books that no one seemed to touch. Samuel was sitting by the window, staring out at the garden. He didn't turn when she entered, and he didn't move when she began dusting the shelves. Most children would at least glance at a stranger, but Samuel stayed still as though trapped in his own world. Angela paused, watching him for a moment. There was something in his eyes, something deep and unreachable that reminded her of her own little brother years ago. She didn't speak to him then. She simply went about her work, humming softly to herself. It was a tune her mother used to hum when the world felt too heavy, a simple, gentle melody. To her surprise, Samuel shifted in his chair. His head turned slightly, not enough to look at her, but enough to show he had heard. That was the first moment Angela realized that behind his silence, Samuel was still listening. The days passed slowly, as they always did in Margaret's grand house. Richard was often away on business trips, leaving Margaret alone with her worries. She spent her mornings calling specialists and her afternoons reviewing plans for Samuel's next treatment. She hardly noticed Angela's quiet presence, moving from room to room, keeping everything in order. But Samuel noticed. One morning, Angela was scrubbing the kitchen floor when she heard small footsteps. Samuel stood at the doorway, his hands clutching the frame. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but with curiosity. Angela looked up and smiled, though she did not rush to speak. She had learned long ago that children like him didn't respond well to pressure. Instead, she dipped her rag back into the bucket, wrung it out, and began scrubbing again, humming the same tune as before. Samuel stepped a little closer. He didn't say a word, but when Angela glanced at him again, she saw his lips moving slightly, as if he were trying to follow the rhythm of her song. From that day on, something began to change. Angela never forced conversation, never demanded attention. She simply allowed Samuel to exist near her without judgment. She hummed while she worked, sometimes even sang softly, her voice carrying old songs from her childhood. Samuel, drawn to that warmth, started appearing more often. He would linger in the corners of the kitchen, sit quietly near the laundry room, or follow her to the garden when she hung clothes out to dry. Margaret noticed but dismissed it. She thought Samuel's presence in the kitchen was just another one of his strange habits. She didn't see the small sparks happening, the silent connection forming between her son and the maid she barely acknowledged. One afternoon, while dusting the shelves in the living room, Angela found Samuel sitting on the carpet with a pile of blocks. He was stacking them carefully, one on top of the other, his tongue peeking out between his lips in concentration. Angela sat down on the floor nearby, not too close, and picked up a block herself. Slowly, she added one to the side of his tower. For a moment, Samuel froze. His eyes darted to her face, uncertain, but Angela only smiled and placed another block, then slid the pile back toward him. Samuel blinked, then picked up a block and added it. Together, without words, they built a tower that reached higher than either of them had imagined. That evening, Margaret walked into the room to find her son sitting beside the maid, quietly stacking blocks. She froze, anger flashing across her face. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice sharp. Angela stood quickly, bowing her head. "We were only playing, ma'am." Margaret's eyes narrowed. She had paid for the best doctors, the most expensive therapists, and none of them had made Samuel engage like this. And now her son was sitting on the floor with a maid, doing the very thing she had feared most, bonding with someone outside her carefully controlled circle. That night, Margaret lay awake, troubled. She didn't like what she had seen. To her, it felt dangerous. What if Samuel grew closer to this woman than to her? What if all her efforts, all her sacrifices were forgotten? But she couldn't deny what she had seen either. For the first time in years, Samuel had chosen to sit with someone, to share something as simple as blocks. And though she didn't want to admit it, Margaret felt the smallest sting of jealousy. Angela, meanwhile, lay awake in her small room at the back of the house thinking of the boy with sad eyes. She hadn't planned to get close to him. She hadn't planned to stir the quiet waters of Margaret's perfect world. But now something told her this was only the beginning. The next morning in the grand house began the way it always did. The sun spilled through the tall windows. The servants moved quietly about their duties, and Margaret sat at the breakfast table with her untouched tea. But under the surface of routine, her mind was restless. The image of Samuel on the carpet with Angela, stacking blocks and showing interest, would not leave her. For years, Margaret had begged Samuel to play, to laugh, to share something with her. She had surrounded him with expensive toys, the best tutors and therapists who claimed they could unlock his silence, yet he had always retreated into himself. Now, suddenly, he had chosen to sit with the maid, the one person Margaret had never trusted to influence her son. Margaret stirred her tea, her hand trembling slightly. She told herself it was wrong. It was dangerous. Angela was a servant, not a teacher or a therapist. What did she know about children? And yet, in her heart, Margaret also knew what she had seen. Samuel had looked at Angela with something she had not seen in years. Interest, connection, perhaps even trust. When Richard returned from his business trip that evening, Margaret tried to hide her unease. She greeted him with her practiced smile, telling him about the house, the garden, the latest call from Samuel's specialist. She did not mention Angela, but Richard, sharp as always, noticed the strain in her voice. "Something is troubling you," he said, setting down his briefcase. Margaret hesitated, then answered quietly, "It's Samuel. I saw him. With the maid." Richard frowned. "With the maid?" "Doing what?" They were sitting on the floor together, playing with blocks. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then, to Margaret's surprise, Richard let out a small laugh. "Well, that's more than he's done with most of the expensive doctors you've hired." Margaret stiffened. "It isn't funny, Richard. She is not qualified. What if she says the wrong thing? What if he grows attached to her?" Richard shrugged. "If he grows attached, maybe that's what he needs. You've spent years chasing experts. Perhaps the answer isn't in all that science and training. Maybe it's something simpler." But to Margaret, the thought was unbearable. It felt like failure. She had done everything a mother could do, and still her child turned to someone else. Angela, meanwhile, went about her work as though nothing had changed. She polished the silver, dusted the shelves, and kept her humming low as she moved through the rooms. But inside, she carried the memory of Samuel's small hands reaching for the blocks, his quiet eyes watching her every move. The following afternoon, Samuel appeared again. He lingered at the doorway of the kitchen while Angela kneaded dough for bread. His presence was soft, almost like a shadow, but Angela could feel his eyes on her. She did not speak right away. She simply continued her work, pressing the dough with steady hands, humming her mother's tune. After a while, Samuel stepped closer. He stood by the table, watching her palm sink into the dough and lift again. Slowly, Angela tore off a small piece, rolled it into a ball, and placed it on the table in front of him. At first, Samuel only stared. Then, with cautious fingers, he pressed it the way he had seen her do. His small palms were clumsy, but he mimicked her movements. Angela smiled, but she did not speak. She only worked beside him, letting the rhythm of the task guide them both. By the time Margaret entered the kitchen, Samuel had flour on his cheeks and dough stuck to his fingers. He looked almost like any ordinary child, engaged, curious, and alive. Margaret froze at the sight. Her lips tightened and her eyes fell on Angela with a mixture of suspicion and fear. "Samuel," she said sharply, "what are you doing in here?" Samuel flinched at her tone, his hands pulling back from the dough. He did not answer. His eyes lowered, and the spark that had lit them only moments before seemed to fade. Angela straightened quickly, bowing her head. "He was only watching, ma'am. I gave him a little piece of dough to try." Margaret's face flushed. "That is not your place. You are here to clean, not to interfere with my son." Samuel shrank further into himself, his small shoulders curling. Angela wanted to defend him, to say that it had been harmless, even good for him. But she knew her place in the house, and so she only whispered, "Yes, ma'am," before returning to her work. That night, Margaret sat in her room, torn between fear and guilt. She had seen something real in Samuel's eyes, a joy she had long prayed for, but it had come from Angela, not from her, and that truth was harder to accept than silence itself. The days turned into weeks, and despite Margaret's warnings, Samuel continued to drift toward Angela. He followed her to the laundry room, sat near her while she polished furniture, and watched her intently as she hung clothes in the garden. Sometimes he would mimic her movements. Sometimes he would sit quietly nearby. Slowly, without words, a thread was weaving between them, thin but unbreakable. One rainy afternoon, Angela found Samuel in the library again, sitting by the window with a book on his lap. She noticed his small hands holding the pages tightly, but the book was upside down. She smiled softly and knelt beside him. "Would you like me to read to you?" she asked gently. Samuel hesitated, his eyes flicking up to hers. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Angela opened the book and began to read aloud, her voice calm and warm. Samuel leaned closer, his small head resting lightly against her arm as she turned the pages. For the first time, he whispered a word. Again, Angela froze, her heart leaping. It was the first word she had ever heard him say. She turned back the page and read it again, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. Samuel's lips curled, not into a full smile, but into something close, a tiny spark of expression that lit his face. But fate is never kind for long. That evening, Margaret entered the library unexpectedly. She stopped in the doorway, her eyes widening as she saw her son leaning against Angela, listening to her voice. For a brief moment, she felt her heart ache at the beauty of the scene, but then jealousy struck like a storm. "Samuel," she called sharply. He jerked upright, the little spark vanishing. Angela quickly closed the book and stood, lowering her head. "What are you doing?" Margaret's voice trembled, though she tried to keep it firm. Samuel did not answer. He simply retreated behind the chair, his small hands gripping the fabric. Angela wanted to explain, to tell Margaret what had happened, that Samuel had spoken, that he had asked for more. But she saw the fear in Margaret's eyes, the fear of being replaced, and she knew that any word she said would only make things worse. That night, Margaret locked herself in her room, crying silently. She had longed for her son's voice for 10 years, and when it finally came, it had not been for her. It had been for the maid. Angela, in her small room, prayed quietly. She prayed not for herself, but for the boy with sad eyes who had spoken a single word. She prayed that Margaret would one day see what truly mattered, not who brought the light, but that the light had finally arrived. But deep inside, Angela also knew the truth. Margaret feared her more now than ever before, for in the silence of the house, Angela had done the one thing no expert had ever done. She had reached Samuel's heart. And Margaret, the rich mother who had spent years searching, could not bear it. The grand house seemed quieter after that evening in the library. Though silence had always filled its rooms, now it carried something sharper, heavier, Margaret moved about her days with an unsettled heart, her mind circling around the image of Samuel leaning against Angela, listening, speaking. It had been what she longed for all these years, and yet the moment had cut her deeper than any wound. She tried to convince herself it was not real. Maybe she had imagined Samuel's word. Maybe it had been just a murmur, an accident, nothing more. But at night, when the world rested, Margaret heard it in her mind again. Again. A word spoken not to her, but to the maid. Richard noticed her unease. He often returned from his business trips to find Margaret pacing the halls, her face pale and her hands restless. "Margaret," he said one evening as they sat at the dinner table, "you must see what is happening. For the first time in years, Samuel is reaching out. Don't fight it." Margaret set down her fork with trembling fingers. "You don't understand. He is my son. I have done everything for him. And yet he gives his first word, his first connection to her, to someone who doesn't belong here." Richard sighed. "Does it matter who? What matters is that he is changing. Perhaps Angela has something the rest of us could not give him, but Margaret could not accept it. To her it felt as though her role as a mother was being stolen piece by piece. Each glance Samuel gave to Angela, each quiet step he took in her direction, seemed to say that Margaret's years of struggle had meant nothing. Angela, unaware of the storm in Margaret's heart, continued her work quietly. She cleaned, she cooked, and she sang. She treated Samuel with patience, never asking more of him than he could give. She did not push him to speak again, though she treasured the memory of his whispered again, as though it were a jewel hidden deep inside her. Samuel began to blossom in small ways. He followed Angela more boldly now, sometimes even reaching for her hand when they walked to the garden. He began to hum the tunes she sang, his voice soft but steady. On rare occasions he let out a laugh, a sound so light it startled even him. One morning, Angela was folding laundry in the garden when Samuel brought her a flower from the edge of the lawn. He held it out awkwardly, his little hand trembling. Angela knelt, her eyes filling with gentle warmth. "Thank you, Samuel," she said softly, accepting the flower as though it were the greatest treasure. It was a small act, but for Samuel, it was everything. For years he had lived in silence, unable to give or receive. Now with Angela he was learning what it meant to share. Margaret watched from her window. The sight of her son handing a flower to the maid filled her chest with a storm she could not control. Tears burned her eyes, not of joy but of fear. She felt herself slipping further away from her own child. That evening she confronted Angela. "You will not take liberties with my son," Margaret said, her voice cold. Angela lowered her eyes. "I only accepted what he offered, ma'am. I would never—" "You will remember your place," Margaret interrupted sharply. "You are here to serve, not to teach, not to influence. My son's care is in the hands of professionals." Angela bowed her head. "Yes, ma'am," but inside her heart ached. She wanted to tell Margaret that no professional could give Samuel what he needed most: patience, kindness, and unconditional love. Yet she knew such words would not be welcome. That night, Samuel slipped quietly into the kitchen while Angela was washing dishes. He stood beside her, silent as always, but his small hand reached for hers. He tugged gently, as if asking her to follow. Angela dried her hands and knelt. "What is it, Samuel?" she asked softly. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice fragile but clear, he whispered, "Stay." Angela's heart nearly stopped. Another word. Another step into the world he had long refused to enter. She swallowed her tears and nodded. "I'll stay." But Margaret, who had entered unnoticed, heard it too. The word struck her like a blade. Her son had spoken again, but not for her, not for his mother, for the maid. In the days that followed, Margaret's jealousy deepened into something darker: fear. She feared losing her son, feared that he would bond with Angela more than with her. She feared what people would say if they knew, the rich mother defeated by her own maid. She began to pull Samuel away. She arranged more sessions with therapists, more lessons with tutors, more activities designed to keep him busy and far from Angela. She demanded Angela spend more time in the upper floors, cleaning rooms Samuel never entered. But children sense more than adults imagine. Samuel noticed her absence. He grew restless, his eyes searching for Angela in every room. He grew quieter again, his small sparks of laughter fading. One afternoon, Margaret tried to engage him with a puzzle. She sat beside him in the playroom, offering the bright pieces with forced cheer. "Look, Samuel," she said. "Let's do this together." But Samuel only pushed the pieces away, his eyes fixed on the door. When Angela passed by with a basket of linens, he whispered her name for the first time. Angela. The sound was so soft, Margaret almost doubted she had heard it. But she had. And the truth cut deeper than ever. Her son had spoken her maid's name before he had ever spoken his mother's. Margaret's face turned pale. She excused herself quickly, leaving the room before Samuel could see her tears. Alone in her chamber, she sank to the floor, her hands covering her face. "How can this be?" she whispered. "Why her? Why not me?" Richard tried to comfort her when he returned, but his words brought no peace. "Margaret, you must stop fighting this. Samuel has found someone who reaches him. That is what matters." But Margaret shook her head. "No, he is my son. If I cannot reach him, then what am I?" Meanwhile, Angela wrestled with her own heart. She had not sought this bond. She had come to the house for work, nothing more. But Samuel had chosen her again and again. She loved him as if he were her own, yet she knew the more he grew attached, the more Margaret's fear would grow. One stormy evening, Samuel crept into Angela's small room. The thunder outside frightened him, and he carried his blanket in his arms. He climbed onto her bed without a word, curling against her side. Angela held him gently, her heart torn between joy and sorrow. She knew this moment would only deepen Margaret's fear, but she could not turn him away. She stroked his hair softly, whispering, "You're safe, Samuel. You're safe." And for the first time, Samuel fell asleep in peace. Margaret discovered them the next morning. She stood frozen in the doorway, her heart shattering at the sight of her son sleeping soundly in Angela's arms. It was then that Margaret understood the truth she had long feared. Samuel had chosen. And he had not chosen her. The morning Margaret found Samuel asleep in Angela's arms was the morning everything inside her shifted. For years, she had feared that her son would never connect with anyone. But now she feared something different, that he had connected with the wrong person. She stood in the doorway, her breath uneven, watching them. Angela was still asleep, her arm draped gently around the boy, while Samuel's small face rested against her shoulder in peace Margaret had never seen before. It was the picture Margaret had long dreamed of, her son finding comfort. But the dream had not included another woman in her place. When Angela awoke and saw Margaret standing there, she sat up quickly, her face pale. Samuel stirred, blinking sleepily. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "Samuel," she said, her voice trembling. "Come here." The boy hesitated. His small hand clung to Angela's sleeve before slowly letting go. He climbed out of the bed and walked to his mother. Margaret touched his hair, but he did not lean into her. His eyes flicked back to Angela as though afraid she might disappear. "Go to your room," Margaret said gently, guiding him away. Once he was gone, she turned back to Angela. "This must never happen again," Margaret said firmly, though her voice cracked. "You are crossing lines. My son belongs with me." Angela lowered her gaze. "Yes, ma'am. Forgive me. He came on his own during the storm. I didn't want to frighten him." Margaret's chest ached, but she could not show it. "You must remember your place. I will not lose my son to you." Angela nodded silently, though her heart broke. She had not meant to take Margaret's place. She had only given Samuel what he had asked for: safety, warmth, presence. But she knew Margaret's fear was real, and her anger would grow if this bond continued. That day, Margaret made a decision. She contacted Samuel's doctors and tutors, increasing his schedule. She arranged activities to keep him busy and far from Angela. The boy's days were filled with lessons and therapies, his time carefully guarded. But Samuel resisted in quiet ways. He dragged his feet to lessons, he sat silent before tutors, and his eyes searched every hallway for Angela. He began to withdraw again, his brief laughter disappearing, his words vanishing back into silence. One afternoon, after yet another session ended in failure, Margaret sat across from the doctor in his office. "He is closing up again," she said desperately. "I don't understand." "We were making progress," the doctor adjusted his glasses. "Children respond to connection, Mrs. Davenport. Sometimes progress does not come from treatment alone, but from trust." "Has he formed a bond with someone recently?" Margaret's throat tightened. "The maid," she admitted bitterly. He listens to her. He speaks to her. The doctor nodded slowly. That may be the key. If he feels safe with her, perhaps you should allow it. Connection is rare in children like Samuel. Do not throw it away. Margaret left the office with heavy steps. She wanted to scream. How could everyone? Her husband, the doctor, even the boy himself believed that the answer lay in a servant. Was all her sacrifice worth nothing? Back at the house, Angela continued to work quietly, though she felt Samuel's absence deeply. She missed his small footsteps following her, his quiet humming, the way he would tug at her sleeve. She tried to keep her distance, respecting Margaret's wishes, but at night she prayed that Samuel would not lose the light he had begun to find. The house grew colder in spirit, even though the summer sun filled its halls. Samuel's eyes dulled and his shoulders hunched. He spoke no more words. Until one evening, Margaret was hosting a dinner for wealthy guests. The house glittered with chandeliers and laughter filled the air. Angela moved silently among the servants, carrying trays and pouring drinks. Samuel sat in a corner of the room, small and forgotten among the grandeur. Suddenly, in the middle of the noise, he stood and walked straight to Angela. He tugged at her apron, his eyes pleading. The room hushed as whispers began to spread among the guests. "Stay," Samuel whispered, his voice clear. Margaret froze, her heart pounding. Her son had spoken again, but in front of everyone and again for Angela. The guests looked on in amazement. Some clapped, others murmured about miracles. Margaret's cheeks burned. She felt the weight of their eyes, their admiration not for her efforts but for the maid. In that moment, Margaret's deepest fear came true. She was no longer the savior of her son's story. After the guests left, Margaret confronted Angela in the kitchen. "You humiliated me," she hissed, her voice shaking with emotion. "In front of everyone, my son chose you." Angela's eyes filled with tears. "I did not ask for it, ma'am. He came to me. I only answered his need." "You are destroying everything I have worked for," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "Do you not see? He is my son. Mine. And yet he looks at you as if you are—" She stopped, unable to finish the thought. Angela clasped her hands together. "Ma'am, I never wanted to take your place. I only wanted to help him. He needs love, patience, safety. That is all." But Margaret turned away, her shoulders trembling. She could not hear it. She could not accept it. That night, Margaret made another decision, one she believed would protect her role as mother. She called the agency that had sent Angela and requested her replacement. Angela was told the next morning. She received her wages in an envelope, along with polite words that felt like knives. "You will leave today," Margaret said, her voice cold though her eyes were red from sleeplessness. Angela nodded, tears burning in her eyes. She packed her small bag, each fold of clothing heavy with sorrow. Samuel found her in the hallway, his little hands clutching her skirt. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Stay." Angela knelt, her tears finally falling. She held his face in her hands. "I want to, Samuel, more than anything. But I cannot," he shook his head, his voice rising in desperation. "Stay!" Margaret stood at the top of the stairs, watching. Her heart twisted, but she did not speak. She told herself this was for the best, that her son must not grow too attached to a maid. Angela hugged Samuel tightly, pressing a kiss to his hair. "You are strong, Samuel. You will be okay. Remember my song and remember you are never alone." With that, she stood and walked out of the grand house. The heavy doors closed behind her, leaving Samuel standing in the hall, silent, tears streaking his face. From that day, the house grew darker than ever. Samuel's words vanished again. He no longer hummed or laughed. He no longer reached for puzzles, books, or blocks. He sat by the window in silence, staring at the garden where Angela had once hung clothes. Margaret tried everything: more doctors, more lessons, more gifts. But nothing reached him. His silence was deeper than ever, and now it carried grief. Richard confronted her at last. "What have you done, Margaret? Can you not see? He is worse without her." Margaret broke into tears. "I had no choice. I couldn't let him love her more than me." Richard shook his head sadly. "This was never about you. It was about him." Margaret sat alone that night, realizing the truth she had tried so hard to ignore. Her fear had taken from her son the very light he needed most. And in the quiet halls of the grand house, Samuel's silence echoed louder than ever, an unspoken cry for the woman who had shown him how to feel safe. The great house, once filled with silence and fear, had slowly begun to breathe again. The walls no longer felt cold, and the light coming through the tall windows no longer looked like pale shadows of joy. Instead, the warmth of laughter sometimes touched the corners of the rooms. For years, pain had wrapped itself tightly around the house like a heavy blanket. The mother, Eleanor, had carried grief so deep it had shaped her every breath. The little boy, Samuel, had lived under the weight of expectations and rules that left no space for freedom. The maid, Ruth, who had once been treated as invisible, was now the voice that had shaken the stillness. She had done the very thing Eleanor feared most. She had spoken the truth aloud, but the truth had not destroyed the house. It had saved it. When Ruth first revealed Eleanor's fear, the house nearly collapsed into its old silence again. Eleanor had believed for years that if she opened her heart, she would drown. She had feared that admitting her pain would make her weak, that letting Samuel see her tears would harm him, and that allowing Ruth's presence to touch her life would lower her standing. But the day Ruth spoke boldly, Eleanor realized the real harm had come from hiding. The walls she had built of silence, of discipline, of cold distance had not protected Samuel. They had made him lonely. They had not healed her. They had only buried her sorrow deeper, and they had not silenced Ruth. Instead, they had given her the courage to speak when no one else dared. The fear Eleanor carried had shattered, not with anger, but with light. Samuel, though still a child, was wiser than his years. He had lived in the shadow of his mother's grief, watching her with both admiration and distance. When Ruth had spoken, Samuel saw something change in Eleanor. For the first time, he saw her eyes soften when they looked at him. One afternoon, Samuel quietly placed a drawing on Eleanor's desk. It was a picture of the three of them, his mother, Ruth, and himself, standing together under the old oak tree in the garden. The lines were shaky and the colors did not stay inside the edges, but the picture carried a message no words could hold. Eleanor picked up the drawing with trembling hands. She saw herself in Samuel's art, not as the distant figure she had tried to be, but as someone standing close to her child, side by side with Ruth. It was Samuel's gentle rebellion. He was telling her what he needed most. He didn't need wealth. He didn't need perfection. He needed love, her love. Eleanor knelt beside her son, pulled him close, and for the first time in years, allowed herself to cry into his hair. Ruth had always known her place in the house, or at least the place society had forced her to stand. She was the maid, the servant, the one who worked in shadow so the rich family could live in light. But she had never believed that love and wisdom belonged to only one class. Her strength came from her faith that kindness could rebuild what fear had broken. Even when Eleanor dismissed her, Ruth never stopped caring for Samuel. Even when her advice was unwanted, she never stopped watching for the right moment to speak. Now, as she saw mother and son embrace, Ruth felt a warmth in her chest she had never known before. She had not simply kept a house clean. She had helped clean wounds hidden in silence. Her quiet strength had not just changed a boy's life. It had softened the heart of a mother too afraid to feel. But healing was not complete. Eleanor still carried the weight of the past, the years of grief after her husband's passing, the fear of losing Samuel too, and the pride that had kept her distant from Ruth. One evening, Eleanor called Ruth into the sitting room. Her voice was soft, almost fragile. "Ruth," she began, "I owe you more than thanks. For years I lived inside a cage of fear, and I made my son live inside it too. You saw what I could not. You gave him what I withheld. I cannot change the years we lost, but I can change the years ahead. If you allow it, I wish for us not to be divided by duty, but joined in care. For Samuel, and perhaps even for each other." Ruth, who had stood many times before Eleanor with bowed head, now lifted her chin. She saw not a mistress, but a mother willing to heal. "You don't owe me, ma'am," Ruth replied gently. "You owe yourself the chance to live free, and Samuel deserves a mother's open heart. That is all I ever wanted for him and for you." The two women sat together in silence. For the first time, it was not the silence of distance, but of peace. Seasons changed, as seasons always do. The garden bloomed again, brighter than before. Samuel's laughter filled the halls, and Eleanor began to walk with a lighter step. She read stories to Samuel in the evenings, stories she had once thought too painful to tell, She opened the windows to let in sunlight instead of keeping them closed with heavy drapes. And Ruth, she remained, not as a maid in shadows, but as a trusted companion in the family's life. Her work continued, but her role grew deeper. She was not simply the one who cleaned, she was the one who cared. Her place in the house became a place of respect. The house itself seemed to stand taller, as though proud to shelter hearts that had chosen honesty over fear. The one thing that saved them, in the end, what Eleanor feared most, the breaking of silence. The exposure of her weakness was the very thing that saved her family. The truth had not destroyed them. It had built them anew. Ruth's courage, Samuel's quiet love, and Eleanor's willingness to face her past had created a story that none of them could have written alone. It was not a tale of wealth or status. It was a tale of hearts learning to be free. The rich mother, the black maid, and the little boy, 3 souls bound not by rules of society, but by the deeper law of love. And so the house, once cold and heavy, became a place where love lived openly. Its walls held not fear but laughter. Its windows let in not shadows but light. For years, experts and teachers and advisors had failed to bring change. But one woman's simple courage, one maid's refusal to remain silent, had done the thing no one else could. And the mother, who once feared that truth would destroy her, discovered that it was the only thing that could truly set her free.